Errol Spence, Keith Thurman, December 17th, fact versus fiction. Alright, y'all, it's your boy Cardinal Red Sports. Let's talk about it. So news came out this morning regarding a potential fight between Errol Spence and Keith One Time Thurman. What surprised me about this is the fact that they were saying that this fight would be taking place in about 5 weeks. And that's something I really don't understand, how you can put a championship level fight together with only a 5-week notice. Is that fair to Errol Spence to put him in a situation to where he could potentially lose all of his titles and only have a 5-week training camp? We already saw the disaster that happened with Manny Pacquiao and the Ordanius Ugas fight, and him taking that fight on a 10-day notice. And that ended up in a complete disaster for Manny Pacquiao. And a lot of people said that the reason he lost was because he was old and not because he wasn't able to properly prepare for Ordanius Ugas. So that would be the first thing for me that would have doubt about the December 17th date. Not that the fight won't potentially happen, but doing it that quickly, and Errol Spence being of the caliber that he is, I doubt that he would allow himself to be thrown into a matchup on 5 weeks' notice. But could it potentially happen? It very well could. If it actually does play out in that way, would you have to say then that either the WBC or PBC boxing is trying to set Errol Spence up? Otherwise, why would you allow him to be thrown into a matchup with Keith Thurman, someone who wouldn't give Errol Spence a shot when he was champion, on such a short notice? It's almost like they're forcing Spence into making hasty decisions, and those hasty decisions could potentially have him lose his title. Now, there was another thing that was referenced within that article, and it had to do with pay-per-view buys and Floyd Mayweather. What they referenced was the fact that Maypac, even though they didn't have the full press tour for that fight still broke records when it came to pay-per-view numbers. Nowhere in my mind do I feel like Spence versus Thurman sets any new records in the pay-per-view buy arena for boxing, because I think Thurman is a little past that point in his boxing career. I don't think his fan base is as big as it was when he was defeated by Manny Pacquiao, and I don't think people are that interested in Keith Thurman versus Errol Spence Jr. Now, hardcore PBC fans, hardcore Thurman fans, hardcore Spence fans, because of the back storyline, I think they're interested in the fight, but the typical boxing fan, I doubt really cares, and I doubt would actually be interested in paying $40, $50, $60 on pay-per-view for a Thurman-Spence fight. Is this a good fill-up fight? Is this a good replacement for TERENCE CRAWFORD? No, I don't think it is. And I think that it's just one of those fights that's easy to make on PBC's accord. So I think a lot of people could say that, hey, it could be potentially PBC trying to set Errol up, but I don't understand why they would do that to that #1 cash cow. You would have to say more that it's the WBC trying to set Errol Spence up more than it is PBC. I just don't understand why they would do that to their #1 prospect. Now, back to the Floyd Mayweather pay-per-view numbers. In the article, they said that this fight could potentially do numbers similar to Maypac. And the number that they threw out there was 1 million pay-per-view buys. And I had to laugh when I read it, because nowhere in my mind do I think this fight does anywhere near 1 million pay-per-view buys. Potentially 300, 400,000. I could give them that. I could say, yeah, they might do 300,000-400,000 off that fight. But 1 million pay-per-view buys, I think, is way over the top and a ridiculous number to throw out there. And they even mentioned the fact that boxing is streamed more than any other sport in the world. So how could you believe that Errol Spence versus Keith Thurman, and Keith Thurman not being active for the past 3 years, could potentially do 1 million pay-per-view buys? I mean, go back to the Mario Barrios fight. That fight did nowhere near 1 million pay-per-view buys. So I don't understand with Spence only doing 250, the 300,000 buys. And I guess you could throw another 100,000 in there for Thurman, which is reaching. I think that's scratching if you ask me. But you could potentially get another 100,000 out of Thurman. That still only puts you around 400, maybe 500,000 buys if you're lucky. So for this fight to reach 1 million viewers on pay-per-view, I think is an astronomical number, and for them to do it on only 5 weeks notice would be, I think, a fairy tale at best. Now, does that mean that Keith Thurman versus Errol Spence won't actually happen? No, I think that there's a high probability that that fight actually happens. Now, I've reported in my last couple of videos that it's not really up to the WBC or Keith Thurman or PBC to determine whether Keith Thurman versus Errol Spence actually happens. It's actually up to Emenos Santanios to give the call, because he has a signed contract by Errol Spence Jr. stating that he would fight him next because of that step-aside money he took for Errol Spence to fight Ordanius Ugas. So the potential for that fight to happen is high, but the probability of it happening on 5 weeks notice, I think, is stretching a little bit, and the probability of it doing 1 million pay-per-view buys, I think that's a little out of this world, to say the least. Not only that, I think they were basing a lot of this on Keith Thurman's gift of gab, his ability to talk well and talk fans into believing that he can give a better fight than his skill sets actually offer. But it's funny that they believe that his gift of gab sells this fight, and nowhere in the article did they mention his ability to box or his boxing skills. That was like a forethought. It was more that Keith Thurman is a great talker, and his ability to talk will convince fans to purchase this fight. And not only purchase it, but purchase it on a 5-week notice. And not only that, convince 1 million people to purchase it on pay-per-view, which I think is completely laughable. Now, is it possible, once again, that they do actually do some decent numbers? 200, 300, 400,000 buys, that is very possible. I think 1 million buys is completely foolish and unreasonable. But hey, to each his own, and you can't stop people from dreaming. But I think that that is a long shot, to say the least. Y'all let me know what y'all think about that down in the comment section below. Hit that like button for me. Share, subscribe. Holler at me on all social media platforms: Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter. More than likely to get a response on the tube, so holler at me over there if you want a response. And we are out of here.
Louisville, home of the best scrapper, also home of the best rapper. Flow dapper, here's another chapter. Ride through, attack you, ride away your laughter. This is what I'm after, blowing on that rapper. Purple keep a bunch to blow. I don't serve it though, murder flow. If it goes down, I'm the first to know. Y'all niggas late, like the Conan show. Overdose, overload, sharp flow, leave him with the open throat. Lewis Keys, cool as Nova Scotia snow. Puff a blunt, poke a hole, nigga, you supposed to know. Lewis Keys, blowing blunts on the open road. Fuck a cop, fuck a speed limit, drive overdose. Keep a bad bitch, hips wide like Oprah's nose.